The ring caught Emily's eye like a ghost from her past. She froze, tray trembling in her hands, staring at the intricate family crest that had haunted her childhood memories. "My father had one just like it," she whispered, not knowing these 7 words would shatter 2 lives forever. Charles Donovan looked up from his coffee, his face draining of color as recognition dawned. The truth they were about to uncover would leave everyone speechless and change everything they thought they knew about family, loss, and the secrets that bind us. Subscribe to discover the shocking revelation that connects these 2 strangers. Emily Carter had served thousands of customers in her 3 years at Meridian Cafe, but something about the man in booth 7 made her hands shake as she approached with his order. Charles Donovan sat alone, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with the modest diner's worn vinyl seats, his fingers drumming against the table with nervous energy that seemed to radiate from his very core. She had recognized him immediately from the local newspapers, the reclusive millionaire who rarely ventured into public, whose business empire had been built on secrets and solitude. As she set down his black coffee and untouched pastry, her eyes caught the glint of metal on his right hand, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The ring was unmistakable, an ornate gold band with an intricate family crest featuring 2 lions flanking a shield, exactly like the one her father had worn until the day he disappeared from her life. The memory hit her like a physical blow, transporting her back to age 7, when she would trace that same design with her tiny fingers, while her father told her stories about brave knights and ancient families. The tray slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering against the table as coffee splashed across the pristine white surface. But Emily barely noticed the mess she had created. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the ring, every detail burned into her memory from countless childhood moments when it had caught the light, just like this. Charles looked up sharply at the commotion, his steel-grey eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see straight through to her soul. The cafe around them seemed to fade into background noise. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, all becoming distant echoes as this moment stretched between them like a bridge across time. She opened her mouth to apologize for the spill, to retreat back into her role as the invisible waitress, but instead heard herself whisper the words that would change everything. "My father had one just like it," she said, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise, yet somehow carrying the weight of 20 years of unanswered questions. Charles Donovan's face transformed in an instant, the color draining from his cheeks, as if she had struck him physically, his hand instinctively moving to cover the ring as though protecting it from her gaze. The coffee cup trembled in his other hand, and Emily watched in fascination as this powerful man, who commanded boardrooms and controlled millions, seemed to crumble before her eyes. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came, only a sharp intake of breath that spoke of recognition, of fear, of possibilities too dangerous to voice aloud. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths and the weight of coincidences too profound to be mere chance. Emily felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that whatever came next would either give her the answers she had spent her entire adult life seeking, or destroy the fragile peace she had built from the ashes of abandonment. The ring seemed to pulse with significance, a golden key to a door she had never dared to hope might open. Around them, the cafe continued its normal rhythm, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring in booth 7, where 2 strangers found themselves connected by a piece of jewelry that carried the weight of family legacy and buried secrets. Emily's mind raced through the possibilities, each more impossible than the last, yet the evidence sat before her in gleaming gold and precious stones. She thought of her mother's tears whenever the subject of her father arose, the way conversations would die when Emily asked too many questions, the mysterious circumstances that had led to her father's sudden departure when she was just a child. Charles seemed to be fighting an internal battle, his businessman's composure warring with something deeper, more primal, the look of a man confronting ghosts he thought were safely buried. The air between them crackled with tension, with the electricity of truth demanding to be spoken, of secrets that had festered in darkness for far too long. Emily realized that this moment would define the rest of her life, that whatever Charles Donovan was about to tell her would either heal the wound that had shaped her entire existence or tear it open wider than ever before. The weight of 20 years pressed down upon them both as Charles slowly removed his hand from the ring, allowing the light to catch its surface once more, as if accepting that hiding was no longer possible. Emily saw her own desperate hope reflected in his eyes, mixed with a terror that spoke of consequences neither of them could fully comprehend. She thought of all the nights she had lain awake wondering about her father's identity, creating elaborate fantasies about why he had left, what kind of man he had been, whether he had ever thought of the daughter he had abandoned. The ring seemed to mock those fantasies now, suggesting a reality far more complex and painful than anything her imagination had conjured. Charles's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper, rough with emotion and heavy with the weight of confession. The truth he was about to reveal would shatter everything Emily thought she knew about her family, subscribe to witness the moment that changes two lives forever. Charles Donovan's hands shook as he slowly twisted the ring from his finger, the metal warm from decades of wear, each turn revealing more of the intricate craftsmanship that had been passed down through generations of his family. Emily watched in mesmerized silence as he placed it on the table between them, the crest catching the afternoon light streaming through the cafe window, transforming the simple piece of jewelry into something almost sacred. The lions seemed to roar silently from their golden prison, their eyes tiny emeralds that had witnessed secrets spanning generations, while the shield bore symbols that spoke of honor, legacy, and bloodlines that stretched back through centuries of carefully guarded history. Charles's voice, when he finally found it, carried the weight of a man who had spent 20 years carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone. "This ring," he began, his words measured and careful, "has been in the Donovan family for over 200 years, passed from father to eldest son, without exception, a symbol of our lineage and our responsibility to those who came before us." His eyes never left Emily's face as he spoke, searching for any sign of recognition, any flicker of understanding that might confirm the impossible possibility that had just presented itself. Emily felt the world shifting beneath her feet as she stared at the ring, her mind struggling to process the implications of what Charles was telling her, the careful way he emphasized the word eldest son, making her stomach clench with a mixture of hope and dread. She remembered her father's hands, strong and gentle, the way the ring had caught the light when he would lift her onto his shoulders, the pride in his voice when he would tell her stories about brave ancestors who had fought for justice and honor. "My father's name was Michael," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue after so many years of silence, of unanswered questions that had shaped her into a woman who trusted no one completely. Charles's sharp intake of breath told her everything she needed to know even before he spoke, his face crumbling as if she had reached across the table and torn his heart from his chest. The cafe around them seemed to hold its breath, the normal sounds of clinking dishes and casual conversation fading into a distant hum as two lives hung in the balance of truth, finally demanding to be heard. "Michael Donovan was my younger brother," Charles said, each word falling like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment, far beyond this small cafe where destiny had chosen to reveal itself. Emily's vision blurred as tears she had held back for 20 years finally found their release, the confirmation of what she had always suspected, but never dared to hope hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She thought of her mother's bitter silences, the way she would change the subject whenever Emily asked about her father's family, the mysterious circumstances that had led to his disappearance from their lives when Emily was just 7 years old. Charles continued speaking, his voice growing stronger, as if the act of confession was lifting a weight from his shoulders that had been crushing him for decades. He left everything behind, his inheritance, his place in the family business, his future, all for love, all for a woman our father deemed unsuitable for a Donovan heir. The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, as if the wound had never healed, as if 20 years had done nothing to diminish the agony of losing the brother he had loved more than his own life. The ring sat between them, like a bridge across an ocean of lost time, its presence both accusation and absolution, proof of a connection that had survived abandonment, silence, and the careful construction of new identities built on the ashes of old pain. Emily reached out with trembling fingers to touch the metal, feeling the warmth that still lingered from Charles's skin, the weight of history and heritage that she had been denied by circumstances beyond her control. "He never told me," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical wound could have managed. "He never told me I had an uncle, that I had family, that there was more to our story than just the three of us in that tiny apartment." Charles's eyes filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide, the successful businessman facade crumbling completely to reveal the broken man beneath, the brother who had spent 2 decades wondering what had become of the family member he had lost to pride and stubborn tradition. The silence that followed was heavy with grief for all the lost years, all the missed opportunities, all the love that had been wasted in the name of family honor and social expectations. Emily felt something fundamental shifting inside her chest, as if pieces of herself that had never quite fit together were finally finding their proper places, creating a picture she had never dared to imagine. She thought of her father's sudden death in a car accident when she was 15, how he had taken all his secrets with him to the grave, leaving her with nothing but questions and a mother too bitter to provide answers. "Why didn't you look for us?" she asked, the question carrying 20 years of abandonment, of wondering if anyone in the world cared whether she lived or died. Charles's face contorted with pain as he struggled to find words adequate to explain the magnitude of his failure, the way pride and hurt had blinded him to what truly mattered. "I tried," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the cafe. "After our father died, I hired investigators, spent fortunes trying to track down Michael and his family, but he had changed his name, disappeared so completely that it was as if he had never existed at all. The revelation that would explain everything and change their futures forever was about to unfold, leaving both uncle and niece speechless with the magnitude of what they had lost and found. The afternoon light streaming through the cafe window seemed to dim as Charles began to unravel the story that had shaped both their lives, his voice taking on the cadence of a man confessing sins that had haunted him for decades. Emily listened in stunned silence as he described their father, her grandfather, a man whose obsession with family reputation and social standing had driven him to issue an ultimatum that would tear his family apart forever. Harrison Donovan was a man who believed that love was a luxury the wealthy couldn't afford, Charles said, his fingers tracing the edge of the ring as if drawing strength from its familiar weight. "When Michael fell in love with your mother, a waitress from the wrong side of town, our father saw it as a betrayal of everything the Donovan name represented." The bitterness in Charles's voice was palpable, 20 years of regret and self-recrimination coloring every word as he described the night that had changed everything. Emily felt her heart breaking for the father she had barely known, understanding now why he had always seemed to carry such sadness, why he would sometimes stare out their apartment window as if searching for something he had lost forever. The story unfolded like a Greek tragedy, each detail more devastating than the last, painting a picture of a young man forced to choose between his family's wealth and the woman he loved more than his own life. Charles described the final confrontation between father and son, the way Harrison had stood in the marble foyer of the family mansion and delivered his ultimatum with the cold precision of a business transaction. He told Michael that if he married your mother, he would be cut off completely. No inheritance, no family name, no contact with anyone who bore the Donovan blood. Charles continued, his voice growing hoarse with emotion. Michael looked our father in the eye and said that love was worth more than all the money in the world, that he would rather live in poverty with the woman he loved than in luxury without her. Emily could picture her father as a young man, standing defiant in the face of everything he had been raised to value, choosing love over legacy in a moment that would define the rest of his shortened life. The image filled her with a pride so fierce it took her breath away, even as it broke her heart for all the years they had struggled financially, while his family's wealth remained tantalizingly out of reach. Charles's confession continued, each word a knife twist of regret as he described his own cowardice in the face of their father's rage. The way he had stood silent while his younger brother was essentially banished from the only life he had ever known. I was supposed to be his protector, Charles said, his voice breaking completely now, tears streaming down his face without shame or attempt at concealment. I was the older brother, the one who should have stood up to our father, who should have fought for Michael's right to choose his own path. Emily reached across the table instinctively, her hand covering his in a gesture of comfort that felt both foreign and completely natural. The first physical contact between uncle and niece spanning 2 decades of separation. The warmth of his skin beneath her palm was shocking in its familiarity, as if some genetic memory recognized the connection that circumstances had severed. She thought of her own struggles, the way she had worked multiple jobs to put herself through community college, the nights she had gone to bed hungry so her mother could afford her medications, all while her father's family possessed wealth that could have changed everything. The revelation that followed hit Emily like a physical blow, leaving her gasping for breath as Charles described the private investigators' reports, the way they had tracked Michael's name change to Carter, her mother's maiden name, but had lost the trail when the family moved across the country. "We were so close," Charles whispered, his voice filled with the agony of missed opportunities and timing that seemed orchestrated by a cruel fate. "The investigators found records of your birth, traced you to 3 different cities, but always arrived just months after you had moved on." Emily felt the weight of destiny pressing down upon her. The realization that they had been living parallel lives of loss and longing, each searching for the family connection that had been severed by pride and misunderstanding. She thought of all the times she had felt incomplete, as if some essential part of herself was missing, the way she had always been drawn to stories of family reunions and long-lost relatives without understanding why. The irony was almost too much to bear, that she had been serving coffee and clearing tables just miles from the uncle who had been searching for her for years. That fate had finally brought them together in the most ordinary of circumstances. Charles pulled out his phone with shaking hands, scrolling through photos until he found what he was looking for, then turned the screen toward Emily with an expression of desperate hope, mixed with terror. The image showed 2 young men standing beside a vintage car, their arms around each other's shoulders, both wearing identical rings and identical smiles that spoke of brotherhood and shared dreams. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized her father's face, younger and unmarked by the struggles that would define his later years, his eyes bright with the confidence of a man who believed the world was full of possibilities. "This was taken the day before he left," Charles said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've carried this picture with me every day for 20 years, hoping that someday I would have the chance to show it to someone who would understand what it meant." Emily stared at the image through tears that blurred her vision, seeing not just her father, but the uncle she had never known she had, recognizing in Charles's younger face the same stubborn determination that had driven her through every obstacle life had thrown in her path. The final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place, revealing a truth that would transform their understanding of family, forgiveness, and the power of love to transcend even the deepest wounds. The photograph seemed to pulse with life between Emily's trembling fingers as she studied every detail of her father's young face, searching for clues to the man he had been before life had worn him down with struggle and sacrifice. Charles watched her with the intensity of a man witnessing a miracle, his own grief reflected and magnified in her expression as she traced her father's image with the tip of her finger. "He looks so happy," she whispered, her voice thick with tears for the father she had known only in his diminished state. After years of working multiple jobs and carrying the weight of supporting a family without the safety net he had been born to expect. The Michael in the photograph radiated confidence and joy, his arm around his older brother's shoulders in a gesture of affection that spoke of a bond that had seemed unbreakable until pride and tradition had driven a wedge between them. Charles nodded, his own tears falling freely now as he allowed himself to remember his brother as he had been before the family schism had torn their world apart. "He was the best of us," Charles said, his voice carrying the weight of survivor's guilt that had haunted him for 2 decades. Michael had this way of making everyone around him feel special, feel loved, feel like they mattered in a world that often seemed designed to make people feel small and insignificant. Emily felt something breaking open inside her chest, a dam of grief and longing that she had built to protect herself from the pain of abandonment, finally giving way under the pressure of truth and recognition. She thought of her father's gentle hands teaching her to ride a bicycle, the way he would sing her to sleep with lullabies that now seemed tinged with the sadness of a man who had lost everything he had once taken for granted. "He used to tell me stories about a magical kingdom where families never fought and love always won," she said, her voice breaking on the words as she realized those stories had been his way of processing the family he had lost, the fairy tale ending he had hoped might still be possible. Charles's face crumpled as he recognized the stories. The same ones their grandmother had told them as children, passed down through generations of Donovans who had believed in the power of love to overcome any obstacle. The realization that Michael had kept those family traditions alive, even in exile, even in poverty, spoke to a loyalty that transcended the bitterness of their separation. Emily could see now why her father had sometimes seemed to be mourning something indefinable, why he would stare at his ring with an expression of profound loss that she had been too young to understand. The weight of missed opportunities pressed down upon them both as Charles began to describe the years of searching, the false leads and dead ends that had consumed his life and fortune in the desperate hope of finding his lost brother. "I hired the best investigators money could buy," he said, his voice hollow with the memory of repeated disappointments. "I followed every lead, no matter how tenuous, traveled to dozens of cities chasing shadows and rumors, always arriving too late or looking in the wrong places." Emily listened in amazement as he described the scope of his search, the way he had essentially put his life on hold for 20 years, turning down marriage proposals and business opportunities because he couldn't bear the thought of building a new life while his brother remained lost to him. The irony was devastating, that while Charles had been searching the country for his missing family, Emily had been struggling just miles away, working her way through school and caring for her increasingly bitter mother, never knowing that help and love were so tantalizingly close. She thought of all the nights she had lain awake wondering about her father's family, creating elaborate fantasies about grandparents and aunts and uncles who might welcome her with open arms if only she could find them. Charles reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a worn leather wallet, his movements careful and reverent as he extracted a folded piece of paper that had clearly been handled countless times over the years. "This is the last letter Michael sent me," he said, his voice barely audible as he placed the yellowed paper on the table between them. "It arrived 3 days after he left, postmarked from a city 2 states away, and I've read it so many times I could recite it from memory." Emily's hands shook as she unfolded the letter, her father's familiar handwriting swimming before her eyes as she struggled to focus through her tears. The words were simple but devastating in their finality. A goodbye that spoke of love and regret and the terrible price of choosing between family and heart. "Dear Charles," the letter began, "by the time you read this I'll be far away, starting a new life with the woman I love more than my own breath. I know you think I'm making a mistake, that I'm throwing away everything we were raised to value, but I've learned that love is the only inheritance that truly matters. Take care of yourself, brother, and know that wherever I am, whatever name I'm using, part of my heart will always belong to the family that shaped me, even if I can never return to it." The letter continued for several more paragraphs, each word a testament to the depth of Michael's love for both his brother and his chosen family, his hope that someday understanding might bridge the gap that pride had created. Emily read through tears that made the words blur and dance, feeling her father's presence in every carefully chosen phrase, understanding finally why he had sometimes seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "He loved you," she said to Charles, her voice thick with emotion as she looked up from the letter. "Even when he left, even when he changed his name and tried to disappear, he never stopped loving you." Charles nodded, his face a mask of grief and regret as he struggled to find words adequate to express 20 years of loss and longing. "I know," he whispered, "and I never stopped loving him. Never stopped hoping that someday I would have the chance to tell him that our father's ultimatum didn't have to be the end of our story, that family is stronger than pride or tradition or any of the things that seemed so important at the time." The silence that followed was heavy, with the weight of all the conversations they would never have. All the years that had been lost to misunderstanding and stubborn adherence to principles that had ultimately meant nothing in the face of death's finality. The moment of truth that would determine their future together was about to arrive, carrying with it the power to heal wounds that had festered for 2 decades. The silence that followed Charles's revelation stretched like a chasm between them, filled with the weight of 26 years of separation and lies. Emily's hands trembled as she reached across the small space between their chairs, her fingers hovering just inches from his weathered face, afraid that touching him might make this moment dissolve like a cruel dream. The restaurant around them had faded into insignificance, the clatter of dishes and murmur of conversations becoming nothing more than distant echoes in a world that had suddenly shifted on its axis. Charles's eyes, those familiar green depths that she now recognized as mirrors of her own, brimmed with tears that threatened to spill over, each drop carrying the accumulated pain of decades spent believing his daughter was lost to him forever. The ring on his finger caught the light again, that simple band of gold that had unknowingly served as a beacon, drawing them together across the vast expanse of time and circumstance that had kept them apart. Emily's breath came in short, shallow gasps as the magnitude of this moment settled over her like a heavy blanket, suffocating in its intensity, yet somehow comforting in its finality. The words, "I'm your father," hung in the air between them, each syllable reverberating through Emily's consciousness like the tolling of a bell, marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. She studied his face with new eyes, searching for traces of herself in the lines around his mouth, the shape of his nose, the way his eyebrows furrowed when he was deep in thought. How many times had she looked in the mirror and wondered about the stranger who had given her life, imagining what he might look like, what his voice might sound like, whether he ever thought about the daughter he had left behind. Now, sitting before her in an expensive suit with calloused hands that spoke of a life more complex than his wealth suggested, was the answer to every question that had haunted her childhood nights. Charles seemed to be conducting his own examination, his gaze moving across her features with the desperate intensity of a man trying to memorize every detail, as if she might vanish if he looked away for even a moment. The resemblance was undeniable now that they both knew to look for it. The same stubborn set to their jaws, the same way their eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when they were thinking, the same unconscious habit of running their fingers through their hair when nervous. Emily realized she was doing exactly that now, her hand moving to smooth down the auburn waves that had always been her most distinctive feature, inherited, she now knew, from the man sitting across from her. 26 years, Charles whispered, his voice breaking on the words as if they were too heavy for his throat to carry. 26 years I've been looking for you, Emily. Every private investigator, every lead, every sleepless night wondering if you were safe, if you were happy, if you even knew my name. His hands clenched and unclenched in his lap, the movement drawing her attention back to the ring that had started this impossible conversation. The simple gold band that had somehow survived decades of separation to bring them together in this moment. Emily felt her own tears beginning to fall, hot tracks down her cheeks that she made no effort to wipe away, each drop carrying with it a piece of the anger and abandonment she had carried for so long. The story her mother had told her, that her father was a drifter who had left before she was born, a man with no interest in the responsibility of a child, crumbled like ancient parchment in the face of this new reality. Here was a man who had spent a fortune and decades of his life searching for her, whose eyes held the kind of pain that only comes from losing something precious, whose very presence spoke of a love that had never wavered despite the impossible circumstances that had kept them apart. The injustice of it all hit her like a physical blow, the realization that they had been robbed of birthdays and holidays, of bedtime stories and scraped knees, of all the small moments that make up the tapestry of a father-daughter relationship. "She told me you didn't want me," Emily managed to say through her tears, the words coming out in a broken whisper that seemed to physically wound Charles, his face contorting with pain, as if she had struck him. "My mother. She said you left when you found out she was pregnant, that you wanted nothing to do with us." The confession hung between them like a blade, cutting through the tender reunion with the sharp edge of betrayal and deception. Charles's face went pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white, the ring pressing into his flesh as if trying to ground him in this moment of devastating revelation. Emily watched as a range of emotions played across his features: shock, anger, heartbreak, and something that looked almost like relief, as if finally understanding the magnitude of the lie that had shaped both their lives somehow made the pain more bearable. The restaurant continued its evening rhythm around them, servers moving between tables, the soft clink of silverware against china, the gentle hum of conversation, all of it a stark contrast to the earth-shattering moment unfolding in their small corner of the world. Emily felt as if she were watching herself from outside her body, observing this scene of reunion and revelation with the detached fascination of someone witnessing a miracle, unable to fully comprehend that this was her life, her story, her father sitting before her with tears streaming down his face. "I never knew," Charles said, his voice stronger now, filled with a conviction that cut through Emily's confusion like a lighthouse beam through fog. "Emily, I swear to you on everything I hold sacred, I never knew about you until 3 years after you were born." His words carried the weight of absolute truth, spoken with the kind of certainty that comes from years of living with a terrible knowledge, of carrying a burden that had shaped every decision and every day since. Emily felt her world shift again, the foundations of everything she had believed about her origins cracking and reforming as this new information settled into place. Charles leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away, his voice taking on the urgent quality of a man who had waited decades to tell this story. "Your mother and I, we were young, we were in love, but we were also from different worlds. Her family had money, expectations, a reputation to maintain. When she found out she was pregnant, she panicked. Not because she didn't want you, but because she knew her family would never accept me, would never accept us." The pain in his voice was palpable, each word carefully chosen to convey not just the facts, but the emotional devastation that had accompanied them. Emily found herself leaning forward as well, drawn into this story that was reshaping her understanding of her own existence, hungry for every detail that might help her make sense of the lies that had defined her childhood. The truth, when it came, was more complex and heartbreaking than either of them could have imagined. A web of family pressure, social expectations, and desperate choices that had torn apart two people who loved each other and condemned their daughter to grow up believing she was unwanted. Charles's voice grew steadier as he continued, as if finally being able to tell this story was lifting a weight he had carried for too long, his words painting a picture of young love, destroyed by forces beyond their control. Emily listened with growing horror and understanding, her anger at her mother mixing with a deep sadness for all three of them, the young couple who had been forced apart, the child who had grown up without her father, and the man who had spent decades searching for a daughter he had never known existed. The ring on Charles's finger seemed to pulse with significance as he spoke, this simple piece of jewelry that had somehow survived the wreckage of their family, waiting patiently for the moment when it would serve as the key to unlock the truth that had been buried for so long. As the last pieces of the story fell into place, Emily realized that this was not just a reunion, but a resurrection, the bringing back to life of a relationship that had been murdered by lies and buried under years of pain and misunderstanding. Subscribe to discover how Emily and Charles navigate the complex emotions of rebuilding a relationship that should have been, and the shocking revelation about who orchestrated their separation that will change everything they thought they knew about their family. The full scope of the deception began to unfold like a map of betrayal, each revelation more devastating than the last, as Charles recounted the elaborate web of lies that had been constructed around Emily's birth. Her mother's family, the prestigious Ashfords, had orchestrated the separation with the cold precision of a military campaign, using their wealth and influence to erase Charles from their daughter's life, as if he had never existed. Emily's hands shook as she absorbed the details: forged documents, bribed officials, private investigators hired not to find Charles, but to ensure he could never find them, a systematic destruction of any connection that might have led him to his daughter. The restaurant's warm lighting seemed harsh now, illuminating the cruel reality of how thoroughly she had been manipulated, how every story about her father had been carefully crafted to ensure she would never seek him out. Charles's voice carried the weight of a man who had spent years uncovering these truths piece by piece, each discovery another knife in his heart, another confirmation that the woman he had loved had chosen her family's approval over their daughter's right to know her father. The ring on his finger had been a gift from Emily's mother during their brief time together, a symbol of promises that had been broken not by choice, but by coercion, a tangible reminder of what they had lost and what had been stolen from them. Emily found herself studying his face as he spoke, seeing not just her father, but a victim of the same cruel system that had robbed her of her childhood dreams of paternal love. The Ashford family's influence had reached into every corner of their lives, Charles explained, his voice growing harder as he detailed the systematic campaign that had been waged against their relationship. They had used their connections in the legal system to ensure that Charles had no parental rights, their wealth to relocate Emily and her mother multiple times, always staying one step ahead of his increasingly desperate search efforts. Emily's mother, barely 18 and completely dependent on her family's support, had been given an impossible choice. Keep her daughter and lose everything, including the financial security that would ensure Emily's future, or cooperate with the plan that would give Emily the best possible life while protecting the family's reputation. The tragedy of it was that everyone involved had convinced themselves they were acting in Emily's best interests, that growing up without a father was preferable to growing up in poverty or scandal. Charles had been painted as unstable, unreliable, a fortune hunter who would only bring shame and hardship to their family, lies that had been repeated so often they had taken on the weight of truth. Emily felt a complex mix of emotions as she processed this information: anger at the manipulation, sadness for her mother's impossible position, and a growing understanding of how thoroughly all three of them had been victimized by a system that valued reputation over love, money over family, appearances over truth. "She fought for you," Charles said softly, his eyes distant as he remembered those final desperate conversations with Emily's mother. "In the end, she fought harder than I did, but they wore her down, convinced her that I would never be able to provide for you the way they could." His voice carried a note of admiration mixed with profound sadness, the complex emotions of a man who had learned to separate his anger at the situation from his understanding of the impossible position Emily's mother had been placed in. Emily felt her heart breaking not just for herself and her father, but for the young woman who had been forced to choose between love and security, who had spent the rest of her life living with the consequences of a decision that had been made under duress. The weight of this knowledge settled over her like a heavy cloak, the realization that her entire life had been shaped by forces she had never even known existed, that every birthday wish for her father to come home had been futile because he had never known where to look. Charles reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a worn leather wallet, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled out a small, faded photograph that he placed on the table between them. Emily gasped as she recognized her mother's young face, radiant with happiness, as she stood beside a man who was unmistakably a younger version of Charles, both of them wearing matching rings, both of them looking at the camera with the kind of joy that comes from believing the future holds nothing but promise. The photograph was like a window into a world that might have been, a glimpse of the family that should have existed if not for the interference of people who believed they knew better than the hearts of those involved. Emily picked up the picture with reverent care, her fingers tracing the edges that had been worn smooth by years of handling, evidence of how often Charles had looked at this image, how many times he had studied her mother's face and wondered about the child they had created together. "I carried this with me everywhere," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was all I had left of her, of us, of the life we should have had together." Emily could see the love in her parents' faces, the genuine happiness that radiated from the photograph like warmth from a fire, and she felt a profound sense of loss for the relationship that had been destroyed before it could fully bloom. Her mother had never spoken of Charles with anything but dismissive indifference, had never given any indication that there had been real love between them, had maintained the fiction that he was nothing more than a mistake she had moved past. Now Emily understood that this coldness had been a protective mechanism, a way of surviving the pain of losing someone she had truly loved, a necessary lie that had become so deeply embedded it had replaced the truth, even in her own memory. The implications of this revelation rippled outward, like stones thrown into still water, affecting not just Emily's understanding of her past, but her entire sense of identity and belonging. She thought of all the times she had felt different from her mother, all the interests and personality traits that had seemed to come from nowhere, all the questions about her heritage that had been met with vague answers and quick changes of subject. Now she understood that these differences weren't flaws or mysteries, but gifts from a father she had never known, pieces of his personality and character that had been passed down to her despite their separation. Charles seemed to be thinking along similar lines, his eyes moving over her face with wonder and recognition, seeing in her features and expressions echoes of himself and his own family, connections that had been denied for far too long. "You have my mother's hands," he said suddenly, reaching out to touch her fingers with a gentleness that spoke of years of longing. "She was an artist, painted the most beautiful landscapes you've ever seen. I always wondered if you inherited her talent." Emily looked down at her hands, these ordinary appendages that had suddenly become precious links to a grandmother she had never known existed, to a heritage that had been hidden from her like buried treasure. The conversation was revealing not just the truth about her father, but an entire family history that had been erased from her life, generations of stories and traditions and love that she was only now beginning to discover. As the evening deepened around them, Emily felt the foundations of her world continuing to shift and resettle, each new piece of information requiring her to reassess everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. The anger she had carried for so long toward her absent father was transforming into something more complex. Grief for the time they had lost, fury at those who had stolen it from them, and a tentative hope that perhaps it wasn't too late to build something new from the ruins of what should have been. Charles seemed to be experiencing a similar transformation, the desperate searching energy that had driven him for decades, beginning to settle into something calmer but no less intense. The relief of finally finding his daughter mixing with the overwhelming task of figuring out how to be a father to a grown woman who was essentially a stranger. The ring on his finger caught the light again as he reached for his water glass, and Emily realized that this simple piece of jewelry had become a symbol not just of the past, but of the possibility of a future, a tangible link between who they had been and who they might become together. Subscribe to uncover the shocking identity of the family member who orchestrated this decades-long deception, and witness the moment when Emily and Charles discover they're not the only ones who have been living a lie. The revelation came like lightning splitting the night sky when Charles mentioned a name that made Emily's blood run cold. Margaret Ashford, her mother's sister, the woman Emily had known all her life as Aunt Maggie, the family member who had always been suspiciously interested in Emily's life and relationships. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity as Charles described the woman who had been the architect of their separation, the puppet master who had pulled every string to ensure that father and daughter remained apart. Emily's mind reeled as she remembered countless conversations with her aunt, seemingly innocent questions about whether she ever wondered about her father, subtle discouragements whenever Emily had expressed interest in searching for him, and most damning of all, the way Aunt Maggie's eyes had always held a secret satisfaction when the topic arose. Charles's investigation had eventually led him to the truth about Margaret's role in the conspiracy, how she had been the one to convince Emily's mother that Charles was dangerous, how she had personally overseen the destruction of any evidence that might have connected them, how she had spent decades monitoring Emily's life to ensure she never got too close to discovering the truth. The restaurant around them seemed to fade into unreality as Emily processed this betrayal. The realization that someone she had trusted and loved had been actively working to keep her from her father, had been lying to her face for 26 years while pretending to care about her well-being. Charles watched her face carefully as understanding dawned, his own expression a mixture of anger and sympathy as he witnessed her world crumble and rebuild itself around this new, terrible knowledge. Margaret Ashford had been motivated not by love or protection, but by a toxic combination of family pride and personal jealousy, Charles explained, his voice taking on a harder edge as he detailed the woman's true character. She had been in love with the idea of controlling her sister's life, of being the one who made the important decisions, of maintaining the family's social standing at any cost. When Emily's mother had fallen in love with Charles, a man from a working-class background with no family connections or inherited wealth, Margaret had seen it as a personal affront to everything she believed the Ashford name represented. She had convinced their parents that Charles was a fortune hunter, had fabricated stories about his character and intentions, had painted him as a threat to both their daughter's future and the family's reputation. Emily felt sick as she remembered how Aunt Maggie had always spoken about the importance of marrying well, how she had constantly criticized Emily's choice in boyfriends, always finding fault with anyone who didn't meet her impossibly high standards. Now she understood that these weren't just opinions, but part of a larger pattern of control, a continuation of the same manipulative behavior that had destroyed her parents' relationship and stolen her childhood. Charles had discovered that Margaret had even gone so far as to hire people to spread rumors about him in their small town, to ensure that if Emily's mother ever had second thoughts about their separation, she would find only negative stories about the man she had loved. The depth of Margaret's deception was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty, extending far beyond the initial separation to encompass years of active sabotage and manipulation. She had intercepted letters that Charles had sent, had bribed postal workers to ensure that any correspondence addressed to Emily or her mother never reached them, had even gone so far as to create fake letters, supposedly from Charles, that painted him as unstable and threatening. Emily's hands clenched into fists as she listened to these revelations, her entire relationship with her aunt recontextualizing itself in light of this new information. Every family gathering, every birthday card, every expression of concern had been tainted by this underlying deception. Every moment of apparent affection had been built on a foundation of lies. Charles pulled out a folder from his briefcase, his movements careful and deliberate as he showed Emily copies of documents that proved Margaret's involvement. Bank records showing payments to private investigators, correspondence with lawyers about maintaining the separation. Even a detailed plan outlining how to discredit Charles if he ever got too close to finding them. The evidence was overwhelming and damning, a paper trail of betrayal that stretched across decades and revealed the true extent of one woman's willingness to destroy lives in service of her own twisted vision of family honor. Emily stared at the documents with growing horror, seeing her aunt's signature on papers that had effectively erased her father from existence, witnessing the cold calculation that had gone into every aspect of their separation. "She's still watching," Charles said quietly, his voice carrying a note of warning that made Emily's skin crawl. "Even now, even after all these years, she has people who report back to her about your life, your relationships, your job." The paranoia that Emily had sometimes felt, the sense that someone was always just slightly too interested in her personal business, suddenly made perfect sense. Margaret had never stopped controlling her life. She had simply become more subtle about it, more careful to maintain the illusion of being a loving aunt while continuing to manipulate events from behind the scenes. Emily thought about her recent breakup with David, how Aunt Maggie had been surprisingly quick to offer comfort and advice, how she had seemed almost pleased that the relationship had ended. Now she wondered how much of that breakup had been natural and how much had been influenced by her aunt's invisible hand, whether David had received anonymous warnings about Emily's family history, or whether other pressures had been brought to bear. The realization that her entire adult life had been shaped by someone else's agenda was almost too much to bear. The understanding that every major decision she had made had been influenced by lies and manipulation that she had never even suspected. Charles seemed to understand her distress, his own face reflecting the pain of watching his daughter discover the true extent of the betrayal that had shaped both their lives. The most devastating revelation was yet to come, as Charles explained how Margaret had continued to monitor his search efforts, always staying one step ahead of his investigations, sometimes even feeding him false information to send him in the wrong directions. She had known for years that he was getting closer to finding Emily, had watched his progress with the cold calculation of a chess master planning her next move. "She knew I was in this city," Charles said, his voice heavy with the weight of this knowledge. "She knew I was close to finding you, and she was preparing to move you again, to relocate you somewhere I would never think to look." Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she realized how close she had come to losing this chance forever, how the simple coincidence of serving Charles at the restaurant had been the only thing standing between her and another disappearance orchestrated by her aunt. The timing of their meeting suddenly seemed less like fate and more like a narrow escape, a last-minute reprieve from a woman who had spent decades ensuring that father and daughter remained strangers. Charles reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring despite the coldness of the truths they were uncovering, his eyes reflecting a determination that spoke of a man who had no intention of letting anyone separate them again. The ring on his finger pressed against her palm as he squeezed her hand, a tangible reminder that some bonds are stronger than the forces that try to break them, that love can survive even the most elaborate attempts to destroy it. As the full scope of Margaret's manipulation became clear, Emily felt a rage building inside her that was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a fury that burned clean and bright and demanded justice for the decades of lies and stolen time. But alongside the anger was something else, a fierce determination to reclaim her life and her relationship with her father, to build something real and lasting from the ruins of what had been destroyed. Charles seemed to be feeling the same mixture of emotions, his jaw set with the kind of resolve that comes from finally understanding the true nature of the enemy they faced. The battle for their relationship was far from over, Emily realized, because Margaret was still out there, still watching, still plotting, and she would not give up her control easily. But for the first time in her life, Emily felt like she had an ally in this fight, someone who understood the stakes and was willing to stand with her against the forces that had kept them apart for so long. Subscribe to witness the explosive confrontation when Emily and Charles decide to face Margaret together and discover the final secret that will either destroy the Ashford family forever or set them all free. The decision to confront Margaret came naturally, born from a shared need for justice and closure that neither Emily nor Charles could ignore any longer. They spent the next hour planning their approach, their conversation taking on the focused intensity of generals preparing for battle, each detail carefully considered and every possible outcome discussed. Emily felt a strange sense of empowerment as they talked, the helpless anger of the past few hours transforming into something more purposeful and directed, a weapon she could finally wield against the woman who had stolen so much from her life. Charles's years of investigation had given him insights into Margaret's psychology, her weaknesses and fears, the pressure points that might finally force her to admit the truth and face the consequences of her actions. They decided to meet her at the Ashford family estate, the imposing mansion where Emily had spent countless holidays and family gatherings, never knowing that she was walking through the halls of her own personal prison. The irony was not lost on either of them that this confrontation would take place in the very heart of the family's power, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had valued reputation over love, tradition over truth. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she thought about facing her aunt with this new knowledge, about looking into the eyes of someone she had trusted and demanding answers for a lifetime of lies. Charles seemed to sense her nervousness, his presence beside her both comforting and strengthening, a reminder that she was no longer alone in this fight. The drive to the Ashford estate felt like a journey through time, each familiar landmark taking on new significance as Emily saw her childhood through the lens of this devastating knowledge. The tree-lined driveway that had once seemed magical now felt ominous. The perfectly manicured gardens that had been her playground now appeared as elaborate stage dressing designed to maintain an illusion of perfection. Charles drove with the steady confidence of a man who had been preparing for this moment for years, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. Emily found herself studying his profile as they drove, still marveling at the reality of his presence, still struggling to reconcile the father she had imagined with the complex, determined man sitting beside her. The ring on his finger caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the car windows, and she realized that this simple piece of jewelry had become a talisman for both of them, a symbol of the love that had survived despite every attempt to destroy it. As they approached the estate's imposing gates, Emily felt a mixture of dread and anticipation that made her stomach clench. The knowledge that the next few hours would either bring them the closure they desperately needed or tear apart what remained of her family forever. Charles seemed to understand her internal struggle, reaching over to squeeze her hand in a gesture of support that spoke volumes about the bond they were already beginning to forge. Margaret Ashford was waiting for them in the estate's formal sitting room, her posture perfect and her expression carefully composed. But Emily could see the tension in her aunt's shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her awareness that this was no ordinary family visit. The room itself seemed to mock their purpose, filled with expensive antiques and family portraits that spoke of generations of wealth and privilege, a shrine to the very values that had torn Emily's family apart. Margaret's eyes moved between Emily and Charles with the calculating assessment of a woman who had spent decades managing crises and controlling narratives, her mind clearly working to understand how much they knew and how much damage control would be necessary. "Emily, darling," she said, her voice carrying its usual warmth despite the circumstances, "what a lovely surprise. And you've brought a friend." The casual dismissal of Charles, the refusal to acknowledge who he was, even when faced with the evidence of Emily's features reflected in his face, was so typical of Margaret's approach that Emily felt her anger flare immediately. Charles remained silent, his presence a steady anchor as Emily gathered the courage to speak the words that would shatter the carefully maintained facade of their family relationships. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, tiny particles that seemed to represent